The world of rock music has always been full of mystery, stories, and hidden truths that only come to light years later. One such story involves two legendary figures, David Gilmour of Pink Floyd and Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane. In the early 1970s, during the height of psychedelic rock, the two crossed paths. At first glance, it seemed like a simple backstage encounter, nothing more than a short meeting between two successful artists. But as Gilmour has hinted in later years, what followed was not ordinary. Grace Slick, known for her wild personality and powerful stage presence, became caught up in an unhealthy fixation. This wasn't about romance in the usual sense, nor was it about professional collaboration. Instead, it was about obsession, a dangerous attraction that left behind years of tension, whispered warnings, and memories that still linger. For decades, Gilmour remained quiet about this strange chapter of his life. But as time passed, the truth began to surface. His reflections offer not only a glimpse into Grace Slick's complicated personality, but also serve as a cautionary tale about the darker side of fame, creativity, and unchecked behavior. The story of Grace Slick is one filled with talent and rebellion, but also with chaos and destruction. To understand what really happened, it is important to step back and look at her world, her battles, and the way her intensity often spilled over into her relationships with bandmates, lovers, and even fellow legends like Gilmour. It was backstage in San Francisco in 1972 when David Gilmour first truly noticed Grace Slick. At that time, Pink Floyd had just risen to worldwide fame after the success of Metal, and Gilmour was beginning to be recognized not just as a guitarist, but as a calm and steady force within his band. Grace Slick, on the other hand, was already a rock icon. As the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane, her voice had become the sound of rebellion, freedom, and psychedelic culture. She carried herself like a queen of the counterculture movement, draped in velvet, with eyes that burned with untamed energy. But Gilmour immediately sensed something beneath the surface. He had already experienced what it was like to deal with brilliance mixed with madness. He had seen it in Pink Floyd's original leader, Syd Barrett. But Grace was different. Her energy was not fragile and inward like Barrett's. Instead, it was explosive, outward, and impossible to control. What began as a conversation about music quickly turned into something deeper and darker. Grace was not looking for friendship or love in a gentle way. According to Gilmour, she seemed to be drawn to his calmness, almost chasing it as something she could never find within herself. But what she offered in return was not stability. It was fixation. Phone calls at strange hours, sudden appearances at his concerts, and cryptic messages made Gilmour uneasy. It was as though she wanted not just his attention, but his full surrender. This wasn't passion, it was obsession. Grace Slick's interest in David Gilmour did not fade quickly. Instead, it grew stronger over time, becoming a source of stress and discomfort for him. Friends close to both artists began to notice strange behavior. At festivals where both bands performed, there were whispers of tension. Grace would make comments, sometimes sharp and cutting, sometimes flattering, but always laced with an underlying demand for control. For Gilmour, who valued peace and balance, this was draining. He pulled back, trying to avoid her advances, but this only seemed to make the situation worse. Grace was not someone who accepted rejection easily. In her life, whether with her bandmates or romantic partners, she often fought for dominance. When that control was threatened, she reacted with anger or chaos. In Gilmour's case, what could have remained a passing connection became years of subtle battles, cold glances, unkind remarks, and a kind of rivalry that was not always spoken but always felt. Yet, it is important to see this in the larger context of who Grace Slick was at the time. She was already fighting battles inside her own band, Jefferson Airplane. Her need for control and her emotional volatility were not reserved just for Gilmour. They spilled into every corner of her life. What Gilmour experienced was only one example of a pattern that would define Grace's career and personal relationships. Her obsession was not just with individuals, it was with power itself. The conflicts inside Jefferson Airplane during the late 1960s and early 1970s were legendary. Grace Slick was at the center of many of them. Her relationship with Paul Kantner, one of the band's founding members, was both creative and destructive. On stage, their chemistry was undeniable, but off stage, their clashes were constant. One moment they were partners, the next they were enemies. Grace demanded control, not just over lyrics, but over the direction of the entire band. Kantner, however, refused to step aside. The result was a constant power struggle that drained the group's energy. With Marty Balin, another key member of the band, the situation was even worse. Balin accused her of being drunk and unreliable, while she accused him of being uptight and jealous. Rehearsals often turned into shouting matches, with bandmates storming out in frustration. Creative meetings collapsed under the weight of insults and anger. For fans, Jefferson Airplane remained a symbol of psychedelic freedom and unity. But behind the scenes, the band was falling apart, with Grace's unpredictable behavior often at the center of the storm. Her obsession with being in control and her inability to accept compromise created an atmosphere of constant conflict. In many ways, her behavior toward Gilmour mirrored the same patterns she showed with her bandmates. For Grace, relationships seemed to be about domination rather than balance, and those who resisted often became her enemies. Grace Slick's problems were not limited to Jefferson Airplane. Her wild and self-destructive behavior followed her wherever she went. On tour in Europe, there were infamous incidents where she arrived late or too intoxicated to perform. In one case in Germany, her condition caused a complete breakdown of a show. Fans grew restless, bottles were thrown, and violence broke out. Promoters threatened lawsuits, and the band's reputation suffered. For most artists, such moments would be a wake-up call. For Grace, however, they became part of her image. She wore them like proof of her rebellion, as if self-destruction was a badge of honor. But in reality, her behavior was burning bridges quickly. Record executives began to see her as a liability. Producers avoided working with her. Even loyal fans started to turn away. Her relationship with alcohol grew darker, fueling not only her reckless stage behavior, but also her personal life. At parties, she was the loudest, wildest person in the room, but her presence could turn frightening in an instant. Stories circulated of her collapsing backstage or being carried off mid-performance. The spiral became harder to ignore. By the late 1970s, her once unstoppable career was on shaky ground. What made her seem untouchable in the 1960s now made her unpredictable and dangerous. Behind the public chaos, Grace Slick's personal life was equally troubled. Her daughter, China, often found herself living in the middle of the storm. Grace would disappear for days, missing birthdays and important family events. When she returned, she was often defensive, confused, or still intoxicated. Growing up in such an environment left lasting scars on her daughter, who later described life with Grace as like living with a ghost, who sometimes screamed. Grace's parents also struggled with her behavior. They tried to intervene, urging her to seek help, to go to rehab, to find stability. But Grace refused. She had built her life around rebellion and resisted any attempt to control her. This resistance, while once seen as part of her strength, now became part of her downfall. Her relationships after Paul Kantner were just as unstable, filled with brief affairs, intense arguments, and emotional wreckage. In one especially dark chapter, she became involved with a roadie in a violent and paranoid relationship that ended in restraining orders. Her drinking only worsened during this time, leading to one of the most shocking incidents of her life, when she drunkenly pointed a shotgun at police who came to her house after a noise complaint. What had once seemed like rock and roll rebellion had now become life-threatening behavior. By the mid-1980s, Grace Slick's life had changed dramatically. The music industry, once eager to celebrate her, had grown tired of her chaos. Opportunities began to fade, and the spotlight she had once commanded with such force now felt dangerous and unwanted. She retreated into isolation, living in her California home surrounded by reminders of her past. The woman who had once set stages on fire with her voice and presence now found herself staring into silence. For David Gilmour and others who had experienced her intensity firsthand, this period seemed like an inevitable result of years of unchecked behavior. Grace had burned too many bridges, alienated too many people, and lost too many battles with herself. Yet, even in her retreat, she remained a symbol of the counterculture era. Her face was still etched into the history of free love, rebellion, and psychedelic exploration. She would occasionally give interviews, showing flashes of humor and wit, but she often dismissed her darker past with a smirk, refusing to fully acknowledge the damage it caused. For fans, this left a confusing legacy. Was she a hero of freedom, or a cautionary tale of self-destruction? For Gilmour, speaking about her obsession years later was not about revenge. It was about reflection, a way to process and acknowledge what he had lived through. His words reminded the world that behind the myths of rock legends were real people who carried real scars. The story of Grace Slick, especially when viewed through David Gilmour's experiences, offers important lessons about fame, genius, and the human cost of rebellion. Grace was without question a talented and influential artist. Her voice became the sound of an era, and her presence helped shape the cultural revolution of the 1960s. But talent alone cannot erase the consequences of destructive behavior. Her obsession with control, her dependence on alcohol, and her volatile relationships left a trail of pain for those closest to her. For fans, learning about these darker truths can be difficult. Many grew up idolizing her as a fearless leader of rock, only to later discover the chaos behind the curtain. But in some ways, this makes her story even more human. She was not simply a goddess of rebellion. She was a person battling demons she could never fully defeat. Gilmour's decision to finally speak out adds depth to her legacy. It reminds us that silence only allows myths to grow, while truth helps us see the full picture. Grace Slick's life will always be remembered for its brilliance and its breakdowns, for its beauty and its brutality. She remains both an icon and a warning, a legend whose story is as complicated as the music she left behind. To truly understand the clash between David Gilmour and Grace Slick, one must first understand who Gilmour was at the time. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Gilmour was never known for being wild or self-destructive. He was calm, collected, and thoughtful, both on stage and off. His style as a guitarist reflected his personality, measured, emotional, but never chaotic. Even during Pink Floyd's most turbulent times, especially after Syd Barrett's breakdown, Gilmour became the quiet anchor who held the band together. This made him a stark contrast to Grace Slick, whose energy was the opposite, explosive, unpredictable, and often self-destructive. When their worlds collided, it was almost like two forces of nature meeting, one representing control and balance, the other representing rebellion and chaos. It is no surprise that Slick was drawn to him. His steadiness was something she lacked and perhaps longed for. But instead of finding peace, she turned her longing into obsession. For Gilmour, this was deeply unsettling. Having seen what unchecked mental struggles had done to Barrett, he recognized warning signs in Slick. The difference, however, was that Barrett's struggles came with fragility, while Slick's struggles came with aggression. For Gilmour, this was not something he wanted to be pulled into. His withdrawal was not out of cruelty but out of survival. Yet in turning away he triggered Slick's anger, leading to years of conflict. Grace Slick's rise to fame cannot be separated from the counterculture of the 1960s. She was more than just a singer. She was the face of a movement. Songs like White Rabbit and Somebody to Love became anthems for an entire generation searching for freedom, experimentation, and rebellion. Grace was fearless on stage, with a voice that carried both power and defiance. She stood out in a male-dominated industry, refusing to play by the rules set by executives, promoters, or even her bandmates. Her boldness made her a symbol of female strength during a time when few women had such visibility in rock. But this role also came with heavy burdens. The same rebellion that made her admired also made her reckless. She believed rules were meant to be broken. And while this gave her music authenticity, it also damaged her relationships and career stability. To her fans, she was untouchable, a goddess who lived by her own laws. But to those who worked with her, she could be destructive and impossible to manage. In this way, her obsession with David Gilmour was not unusual. It fit into her larger pattern of pushing boundaries and refusing to accept limits. Just as she fought with bandmates and challenged record labels, she tried to pull Gilmour into her storm. And when he resisted, she responded the way she always did, with confrontation and intensity. When we look back at rock history, the stories of conflict, obsession, and downfall often become as memorable as the music itself. Grace Slick's story with David Gilmour, though not widely known until later, represents the darker side of this era. Rock music in the 1960s and 70s was not just about creativity. It was also about excess. Drugs, alcohol, and power struggles destroyed many artists who might have had longer, brighter careers. Slick's obsession with Gilmour, while personal, also symbolizes how fame magnified personal flaws. What might have been a private struggle in an ordinary life became a public spectacle in the world of rock. Fans rarely saw this side of their idols, but behind the stage lights, these battles left scars on artists and those around them. Gilmour's quiet reflections remind us that not every legend enjoyed the chaos of the rock lifestyle. Some, like him, tried to maintain peace and balance in an industry built on rebellion. His decision to speak about